My father was a hard man. To say he terrorized my mother and me is an understatement. He wasn't a drinker. He was just an angry, hateful man. It was in his blood, in his nature. It would only take a small infraction for him to go off the handle, yelling, screaming, throwing things. He would hit me, hit my mother, completely lost in his madness. He would get a look in his eyes, a burst of dark fire when he was like this. I came to know that look all too well, as did my mother. He would tell us we were nothing, belittle us, humiliate us, make us feel like we were nothing. I was a kid. I didn't know any better. I always remember feeling afraid constantly. Whenever he got home from work, I tried my best to turn invisible until bedtime. When I managed to stay under the radar, he tended to direct his anger at my mother. My mother was a fairly large woman, something my father constantly reminded her of. When dinner wasn't made or when the house wasn't clean to his standards, he'd berate her. He'd call her a lazy fat cow, a slob, a tragically pathetic pig. He'd hit her, making barnyard animal noises. It was awful. But it was all I knew. Like I said, my mother was a big woman, but she was a timid soul. She spoke in hushed tones, probably from years of abuse. She never raised her eyes from the floor. She was ashamed of her weight. But food was one of the few comforts she found. Sometimes before school, I would hear my father screaming at her from my bedroom and then leave for work. I'd come out to the kitchen and she'd be sitting at the kitchen table with a pint of ice cream, crying and eating. A lot of the time she would be bruised, a reminder from my father that he was in charge. I don't know why she didn't leave him. I don't know why anyone didn't step in and help us. I felt like a prisoner in my own life. I felt like there was something wrong with me. I didn't understand why my dad would get so angry. I remember on my 7th birthday, my mother bought me a stuffed animal. Well, it wasn't really an animal. It was a ghost plushie. It was about as the size of 2 fists and colored black. It had 2 big blue eyes, and the fabric was conformed so that the ghost had a little tail in the shape of a twisted teardrop. It looked like a cartoon ghost, but colored that strange dark shade. I loved that thing. I named him Spooky, and he became my best friend. Spooky would listen to me, lay with me, let me cry into him if need be. I took Spooky everywhere, his little squishy body clutched into my arms. He was my comfort against the onslaught of my father's rage. Even if my dad hit me or yelled at me, I would find comfort knowing that Spooky would be there afterward. He was my constant safety net in a very confusing time of my life. In a very confusing time in my life. My mother never liked talking about my father, always brushing away the subject if I brought it up, telling me to just be on your best behavior. But Spooky would listen, would help me make sense of the violence and anger. His big blue eyes were filled with kindness and compassion, always offering me a warm hug when I was filled with sadness. The lines of reality began to bend in my mind the more time I spent talking to Spooky. I relied on his constant presence to the point of concern. This was during the time my father was in between jobs and his temper was out of control. I would lay curled up in my bed, shaking, listening to my mother trying to pacify my father. This was when I started to pray to Spooky. I begged him to take me away from the nightmare I lived in. I prayed for him to save me. Every night, I would prop him up on my pillow, his soft, black body, a contrast to the white sheets, and whisper my desperate requests. I began to believe that Spooky was alive. I thought I could hear him talk to me a few times, gentle whisper just behind my ear. When I prayed to him, I could feel this energy radiating from him. There were times I could have sworn I saw his big blue eyes move. In my head, I would imagine him speaking to me, his voice a gentle, mature rumble. This went on for 6 months, my nightly prayer, my ritual. My parents never knew about it, but I felt that if I kept at it, I would be saved from my unhappiness. And something did happen. I'll never forget that night. I woke up, blue and red lights flashing outside my window. I heard people in my house, a rush of feet and urgent voices. My mother came running into my room and clutched me, followed by police officers. I was disoriented and sleepy, the surge of activity scaring me. The officers took my mother and I out of my bedroom as we left. I realized Spooky was missing. I began to sob, begging the police to retrieve my ghost plushie. I remember the look that passed between their eyes, a somber, fearful look. We were led outside, where my mother was questioned. Her voice a broken jumble of nerves. She was crying, and I saw that she was scared. I didn't hear what the officers were asking her, mesmerized as an ambulance came screeching to a stop in front of my house. No one would talk to me. A jumble of bodies and rushing people, a constant stream of paramedics and officers poured into my house. I was lost in the confusion, questions bubbling in my mind. It wasn't until years later that I found out what happened. My father had died. My father had suffocated. They found Spooky jammed halfway down his throat. My prayers had been answered. I never saw Spooky again after that night. I never talked to my mother about it either. Until last night. It's been 20 years. We're doing much better now. I have my own place, but insisted she move in with me. She's a broken woman. The years of abuse shattering her mind. She needs help with a lot of things, but we can still talk and find ways to laugh. She's my mom, and I'll be with her until her soul leaves this earth. I'll be there to take care of her and tend her every need. Last night, a couple of drinks and a few hands of cribbage. I pressed my mother about that night. It had been on my mind lately. A constant nag that rose up from the darkness of a bad childhood. It was something I needed to clear my head of. It was a mystery that, with age, needed to be heard. My mom looked at me with sharp eyes. and took another hesitant drink from her glass before answering. You don't remember anything from that night? She asked. I shook my head. Her eyes went wide. You don't remember what happened? No, Mom, I said, placing a hand on hers. All I remember is waking up in my bed to police sirens. She took another sip from her glass and set it down with a trembling hand. Son, she started, her eyes dark and focused. You came into our room that night, clutching that little ghost toy. I furrowed my brow at her. I had no clue what she was talking about. She licked her lips and wrapped her hands around mine. Son, you told me you wanted to free us from your father. I felt my heart begin to race. Mom, what happened? Pain entered her eyes. You climbed up on the bed next to me, next to your father, and you shoved that ghost down his throat while I sat on him and held him still. I had never seen you like that before. It was like you were someone else. I knew I should stop you. Knew I had to do something, but tears spilled from her eyes. But I just hated your father so much that I let you kill him. My vision swam, and I felt bile rise in my throat. Blackness crept into the corner of my vision, and my stomach churned. I put a hand to my head and forced myself to breathe. I looked at my mother with desperate eyes. No, Mom, that was spooky. I prayed to him, and he killed Dad. It had to be. My mother was openly crying now and squeezed my hand. No, son. It was you.